So now we're moving to ancient Greece, and that's the map we're looking at, the area of the ancient Greeks. So this area over here in ancient times was called Anatolia. Today it's part of the modern day country of Turkey. And then these parts, which are modern day Greece, including Macedonia, are also part of the area that we're talking about. But we're mostly going to concentrate on Athens, which is located right here. So people such as the Mycenaean and Minoan had developed complex cultures by 2000 BC, and we talked a little bit about that in the last lecture. And it declined about 1100 BC. And like I said, this is something that happened in many parts of the world. It's kind of called the Bronze Age collapse sometimes. So from 1100 until about 800 BC, it's called in this area the Dark Ages. So the Minoans had some writing. We can't read it, but they did write. But during this time, writing was lost. So in 800 BC, writing returns. And the ancient Greeks thought of themselves as being two different peoples, the Dorians, who lived in the mainlands, and the Cyclades, and the Ionians. And that's the east, including Athens, islands, and Anatolia. And you can see Troy is located right there in Anatolia. So the historical period, in other words, the kind of way that the Greeks looked at themselves and wrote about themselves, starts with the Olympic Games in 776 BCE, the first Olympic Games. So that is the year zero for the ancient Greeks. And if you look at cultures throughout the world, you can tell a lot about what they value from what they put at year zero. So in Western cultures, they're Christian. So the year zero is the traditional birth year of Christ. And then in Islamic cultures, year zero was when Muhammad escaped to Medina. So you can see that was very important to Islamic culture. In Judaism and Jewish culture, the year zero is literally the beginning of creation, so the beginning of the world. So you can tell that the ancient Greeks value the Olympic Games and athletics, and we'll see how the male athlete and their bodies become this kind of symbol of human perfection. But it's also something that is a little bit wider in meaning, in that the Greeks, they were never united in ancient times. It was only in the 19th century that the modern day country of Greece was a united political unit. But when the Olympic Games were held, these city-states like Athens and Sparta are some of the most famous ones, who would be fighting with each other over trade and various other things, would stop fighting and they would get together and play these games, which were athletic events. So this is a way for the ancient Greeks to think of themselves as citizens of Hellas, so of the ancient Greek culture, basically. So during these games, it was only men that competed, and they just had a few events, none of which have really made it to modern times, other than the long jump, perhaps. And when they competed, a lot of them were combat sports, by the way, like wrestling and things like that. When they competed completely nude. So not only is the male athletic body become like the symbol of perfection, but the male nude becomes a symbol of perfection as well. So the Greek city-states are called polis. So, think of a city in America like Minneapolis, comes from that idea. They were always in competition, and this is political and economic competition. The area of Greece is mountainous. So unlike ancient Egypt, where we saw the Nile kind of connecting everything together, you don't have that in ancient Greece. So it might be one of the reasons why it was difficult for people in ancient times to kind of like unite these areas under one political unit like they had done in ancient Egypt. But again, the citizens of Hellas got this kind of Greek identity after a war with Persia. from 490 to 479 BCE, which they basically were able to defend themselves from this empire that was even bigger than the ancient Egyptian empire that we talked about before. And during this war, they had the Battle of Marathon. And the name for the modern race comes from the stories that are associated with this battle. So it's kind of a legend. I'm not saying this is true, but I'll tell you the story anyways. So after in a very important battle at Marathon, the distance from the city of Marathon to Athens is about 26.2 miles. I don't know what that is in meters. Sorry if you use the metric system. And what the Greek general had done is he sent a messenger from Marathon to Athens to report what happened in the battle. So this messenger took his job really seriously. He ran the entire way to Athens. He ran so hard that he was near death when he reached Athens, and he could only get one word out, and that word was Nike, which means victory. So you can see the distance relates to the modern day competition, which was first held in 1896 in the first modern Olympic Games in Athens. That particular event was kind of to harken back to ancient Greece. And also, obviously, the shoe company, Nike, took that on. And you can see why they would do so based on what happened. So the Greeks were very ethnocentric. Most of the cultures we're going to look at are going to be ethnocentric. And they looked at non-Greeks as, the word in English is barbarians. But it comes from an onomatopoeia. An onomatopoeia means a word that makes a sound. So like rough for like a bark for a dog. So the onomatopoeia was barbarous. In other words, whenever they heard foreigners speaking, they couldn't understand their language. So they thought it just sounded like gibberish, like bar, 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 bar. So they were very ethnocentric, and they looked at others as being less than human, and as Greeks being the only fully human people. So you can kind of get this idea that the Greeks aren't necessarily the best people, certainly not in a modern sense. But they had some ideas that made their way into cultures around the world. One of the ideas is humanism. And certainly other cultures had humanistic ideas, but the particularities of the ancient Greeks and the way they thought of humanism made their way into modern culture. A lot of times what you'll see in a class like this, whether it's a history class, but especially an art history class, is there will be an overstating of the importance of Greece. In other words, they'll look at the ancient Greeks as the sole kind of source for Western culture. And there's a couple of problems with that. First off, like saying what Western culture is very difficult since there's many, many Western cultures, many European cultures. And then the other thing is that we've already seen, and we're going to see more evidence of this, that cultures like ancient Egypt, and we hadn't studied ancient Mesopotamia, which is modern day Middle East, but also it'll influence Western culture. So I'm not going to do that in this class, but I will show what the ancient Greeks did, how they were influenced by the cultures that came before them, and we'll kind of see what their influence is along with the other cultures later on. So this is from Kleiner, and I think it's a really good quote because it tells you something about the ancient Greeks and their religion. So the Greeks made their gods and the humans, and their humans and the gods. So if you read Greek mythology, you'll notice that the people that are called gods tend to be, if you knew them in real life as people, you would probably not like them and probably try to steer clear of them. They're neurotic and vindictive, and they tend to have all the human foibles. Whereas if you think of famous ancient Greeks, like Socrates is probably the best example, often they're seen as these incredible, almost like perfect people in a way. Socrates literally committed suicide rather than going back on his philosophy. So humanism, there's a lot of different ways to define it, and I don't necessarily When I think of humanism personally, I don't necessarily think of it as this way, but it's a way that is accurate as far as to how the Greeks looked at it. So a doctrine, attitude, or way of life centered on human interests or values, especially philosophy that usually rejects supernaturalism and stresses an individual's dignity and worth and capacity for self-realization through reason. So we're going to look at later Christianity and Islam, and the symbol of perfection in those religions will be God. Whereas the ancient Greeks didn't necessarily look at that. Instead, they thought of humans being able to perfect themselves, never being able to reach it, but trying to do the best that they could. So Kleiner says that there's an enormous debt to Egypt and the Near East. That's true, and we're going to see the influences in the first Greek art we look at. But even when you look at these values and you say, oh, wow, there's some really good thinking and values in ancient Greece, there's also some very patriarchal, racist, xenophobic types of values. So the Greeks had slaves. In Athens, they considered themselves to be a free place where everyone voted, they had democracy, but they had slaves. So this is one of those ideas, and the status of women was very low. We're going to see a lot of misogyny in art, in the way that women are portrayed in art reflects how women were treated in real life. And you can kind of relate that to modern cultures. You can think about the US, and it was supposedly founded on freedom and democracy, but then realized that Black people were enslaved, that women couldn't vote, and in some places not even own property. So think about that when people are talking about values in general, what they value, and then try to look at the culture and see how they actually treat people, rather than just taking the statement of their values at face value. So Greek art is, by later art historians, generally broken into these parts. The geometric style is from 900 to about 725 BC. It doesn't matter if we go over it, so we're not going to. There's not really much there. I'm not going to go over it for the same reason I didn't go over pre-dynastic Egyptian art. It's just not that different from what you would see anyone else producing. The Orientalizing style from 725 to 650 refers to a word that's not really used anymore, but it used to be in the early 20th century and before, when people talked about anything that was east of Turkey, they would call that the Orient. So basically all of Asia, what we call modern day Middle East. And the reason why they called it that is because in the Bible, the first cultures are in the Middle East. So it's the place where humanity was oriented, where it first came from. So what this means, the Orientalizing style, is the influence of the Middle East and ancient Egypt. So the archaic style we'll look at next, and that's when we start to see some things that are pretty uniquely Greek. And then these styles are called the classical styles, so the early classical, middle classical, and late classical. First off, using the word classical tells you more about art historians than about the art. I don't value any of these styles more than another. But in the 19th century, when people were first thinking about, and this is people in Europe, when they were first thinking about how they could categorize some of these styles, they thought that what was in a classical style, which we'll see is rather staid, not very emotional, they considered that to be the highest form of art. And again, that says something more about Europeans in the 19th century and European art historians and what they value, and less about what is valuable inherently. So I love all these styles, and I'm not gonna, one isn't more classic than the other. So the Hellenistic period, we're not actually going to look at the art from that period, but it changes from the classical style and becomes much more dynamic. So some of the characteristics that we see, and these are the characteristics I tried to pick out that were more unique, most of them, to ancient Greek art. So increasing naturalism. Like we saw in ancient Egypt, things that were look like real humans, but they didn't generally want them to be very natural looking. So it was less important that you showed something that was natural, like from real life in ancient Egypt, and more important that you showed their role. Whereas in this one, we're going to see idealism, meaning we're going to see perfect figures, but they're trying to make them look as close to what you would see in real life as possible, but an idealized and perfected version of what you would see in real life. If that makes any sense? So like in most art, we'll see balance. We'll kind of understand what the ancient Greeks thought about that. Order and proportion. So they, like the ancient Egyptians, had canons of proportions, meaning certain types of proportions between body parts that were standardized at the time and most people thought was what you needed to make a beautiful work of art. We'll see the heroic nude, and again, that comes from the idea of the Olympic Games and human perfection. And the heroic nude is always going to be male. And the reason why that is because of the kind of misogyny that's built in ancient Greek culture. Ancient Greeks looked at men as these kind of like rational beings that could perfect themselves, and they looked at women as being inherently emotional and not able to become, you know, kind of a humanistic person. And these types of ideas about men being kind of like rational and being able to get to the heart of the matter, and women being more emotional and less in control of themselves, informed Western cultures and other cultures around the world. And we still see it today. You just have to think about how people are treated in the media, or how you can see in your own life how women versus men are treated sometimes. Luckily, a lot of people today are trying to work against those pretty damaging stereotypes. But for the Greeks, it was what they thought was true. So it's one thing to know about the Greeks is it's inherently misogynist. We also see a certain amount of individualism, but individualism is a loaded word. Individualism can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. And that's the same thing with the Greeks. But the idea was kind of related to the humanistic ideas we had before, that each person can kind of find themselves and do the best for themselves. And the last thing we're going to see is art for art's sake. All the art that we had seen in ancient Egypt, although beautiful and it can function as art for art's sake, it had a purpose. Whereas in ancient Greece, we start to see the idea of the art represents an idea, and that's it. It doesn't necessarily have a purpose. So I have to put in dad jokes every once in a while. So the one thing we're going to look at from the Orientalizing style are the lions of Delos. So they're so named because they influence the Middle East in Egypt, the Orientalizing style. And these are worn down a lot. They're made out of marble, but they once would have looked pretty similar to the Sphinxes that we saw in ancient Egypt. So they like those, they saw those, and they're like, we're going to do some of that. So Delos which is a place you can visit today if you want, was the birthplace of Apollo. So Apollo is a mythological figure, so we're not talking about an actual birthplace. So Delos was taken by the island of Knossos in the 7th century BC, and they erected these lions leading from the Temple of Leto. So kind of like we saw in ancient Egypt, where it would be a symbol of power, it's the same thing with this sort of thing. So you can see how there's sphinxes in a processional way at a temple in ancient Egypt, and that's how these lions would have functioned very similarly. So the archaic style is when we start to see things that are more unique to the ancient Greeks. So this is the New York Kouros. The reason why it's called New York is because it's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It doesn't have anything, it wasn't made there and doesn't come from New York. And Kouros just means boy. So when they have these masculine figures, they call them Kouros, and we'll find out the name for the feminine figures a little bit later on. So these were the first monumental sculptures of human figures in Greece. They are monuments, but we don't necessarily know who they were monuments for specifically, but they were grave markers or individuals honored in religious sanctuaries. So technique and style is learned from the Egyptians. So if you go to this next slide, you can kind of compare and contrast some of the qualities that they have. The shapes of the bodies are very similar. The stance is very similar. It's kind of stiff. And we can even see that interesting kind of sharp shin and square knees that we saw in ancient Egypt that isn't particularly realistic. So even in this archaic period, they're borrowing heavily from previous cultures that had come before them. But the biggest difference that you'll notice is, first off, we don't really see anything that tells us that this guy is special, whereas with this, we see the crown and the Nemes headdress and the fake beard and everything. We know this is a special person. This figure, however, is nude. So this is the first kind of indication. Remember, in ancient Egypt, if you're nude, you're an enemy. In this case, this is representing a sort of like human perfection in the nude. And the last thing is that in ancient Egypt, especially with the pharaohs, they generally be left in the block. In other words, you couldn't walk to the back of them and see them. And part of the reason why is because the pharaohs wanted to portray themselves as being eternal, as never changing. So by never emerging from the rock, they can be associated with this kind of eternal idea that people think of when they think of stone. Whereas with the ancient Greeks, they're cutting it away completely from the block. You can even see it kind of from the side. So they have a different idea of what they're doing. They're not necessarily portraying a godlike figure that's eternal. They're perhaps portraying a more human-like figure. So these figures were originally painted. You can see traces of it here. This type of paint is called encaustic. It would have been very bright and kind of shimmery, so it would have looked good with the flesh tones. So apparently the Greeks felt that the statue ought to consist only of a stone that has a representational meaning with an organic whole. So normally I ask the class this question, but I'll just kind of answer it since I'm the only one talking right now. So how does it differ from Egyptian sculpture? Egyptian sculpture, they were trying to portray a status. They had a purpose for it. They were trying to serve the king in the afterlife and protect his soul. Whereas with this art, it kind of just exists and has meaning within its own and doesn't necessarily have a purpose that's separate from it. So that's what Jansen's trying to get at with this statement. So the Egyptian obsession with permanence was alien to the Greeks, who were preoccupied with finding ways to represent motion. We're not quite here yet, but we will see it in later styles. So this Hera Samos, she stood outside a temple to Hera on the island of Samos. And you can already see the way that people, the ancient Greeks, looked at women and men as differently. One of the implications of thinking that men are rational and women aren't, that men are able to protect themselves, be the only true intellectuals, while women aren't capable of such things and aren't able to control their emotions. One of the implications of that is that when you show a nude male body, it can represent an idea that's not sexual. But because they looked at women as being inherently emotional and not able to control their emotions, women's bodies were thought to be inherently sexual. So there's a taboo that lasted until the Hellenistic period against showing the female nude. We'll see a little bit later on when we talk about the Parthenon, how artists got around this. But that's the idea. So when you see these bodies, it doesn't represent like a modern sense of like modesty. Like some cultures, they say we cover up things because we want to be modest. Instead, it represents a fundamentally different way of looking at how women are versus how men are. But given that, you can also try to apply these ideas to modern times and think about how bodies are treated, feminine bodies are treated in our culture versus male bodies. The easiest way to do this is if some of you have dress codes and you go to public school, you may notice that the dress codes for women are far more restrictive than they are for men. And normally in my class, I'll ask the class if anyone is allowed to wear tank tops to class, to school, even if it's really hot and it's, towards the end of the semester. And the students always say, no, you can't. And so why is that? Because they don't see men wearing tank tops. It's only women that wear tank tops. And it comes from this idea that women's bodies are inherently more sexual and that has to be protected. So unfortunately, some of these misogynist ideas about women made their way into modern culture. So she just has a cylindrical shape. We don't see her body. Same thing with these ones, with the peplus. Peplus is just a garment that women wore at the time, so that's what they call the feminine figures. And kare is just girl, so a girl wearing a cloak. So the male was nude in this period, but women were always clothed. And I kind of explain what the thinking was behind that. This one's a little bit less rigid than the earlier archaic sculpture. You can see how she's a little bit more relaxed, and she has a smile in her face. Reveals more contours of the body than Hera Samos, but still pretty shapeless compared to what we saw with the men, and obviously covered up. Oftentimes people will call this style the archaic smile in reference to this style of art. So further distinguishing the peplus kare from earlier archaic figures is the so-called archaic smile, which accentuates the fact of being alive. The artist has handled the smile organically by curving the lips upward and raising the cheekbones in response. So the Greeks are doing something that you didn't necessarily see with the ancient Egyptians. They're thinking of the body as a mechanism and realizing when you make one change to that mechanism, then other parts are changed. So when you smile, it's pretty hard to smile without your eyes. So we see when the person smiles, the rest of their face changes in response. And we're going to see the Greeks kind of continue that in their quest for naturalism. So remnants of the paint can still be seen, and caustic is a type of paint mixed with wax. So it would have been shimmery and brightly colored, really beautiful when it was originally made. So you get to the earlier classical style, we can see a bunch of changes have happened in this Critias boy. And the Greeks were invaded by the Persians 490 BC, and they finally repelled the Persians, which at this time was the most powerful empire in the world. And the Greeks from thereafter had a greater awareness of their common culture because these warring city-states had to work together to be able to repel the Persians. And I should mention, if you've ever seen that movie 300, which is based on a graphic novel, I believe, and it tries to show the Spartans as being the main force that repelled the Persians, that's just not true. The Athens was always the main force, and the Spartans were never as powerful as the Athenians. So you see a bunch of changes going on. The early classical style produced radical changes in the approach to the human figure. It reflects a moment of self-awareness in Greek history that is marked by the change from the archaic to the early classical. So let's compare these styles and see what has changed. One of the things you'll notice is that the body is quite different. In this one, we see the surface of the body, but we don't really get an idea of what's underneath. Whereas this figure, not only do we see the surface, we can see his muscles and his bones. We can see the mechanism of the body working. And to kind of emphasize that, the artist does something that's a little bit different. So in this one, the figure is just straight up and down, but most people don't stand like that. You would see that as kind of like a problem. This person's too stiff. This one, we can see one leg is bent, one leg is straight. And look what that does. Remember, I was talking about the mechanism of the body with the archaic smile. If you bend this knee, then this hip will have to cant this way to be able to balance that out. And then they also turn the torso slightly, facing that way, and then respond to that with the face kind of turning the other way. So this is the way that the Greeks could show the mechanism of the body, but also show balance in movement. So it's more naturalistic, meaning this guy looks like someone you could see in real life. He originally would have had eyes. Sorry, they're missing. That makes him look less like real life. Less rigid. Only the hair is stylized. If we got close on the hair, you could see how it's not very realistic. Contrapposto is what we call this stance, where it's bent and straight, rigid, and relaxed. So a stance of the human body in which one leg bears the weight while the other is relaxed, creating asymmetry in the hip-shoulder axis. So if you bend one leg and put more of your weight in the other, it changes the balance of your whole body, and the Greeks portrayed that in their art. So for the first time, a contrast between the rigid and relaxed elements allow the viewer to feel the inner workings of the human body. And one thing I should mention is people usually notice in class, they're itching to ask me a question. And sometimes they're embarrassed to ask it. So I'll just tell you what they normally want to ask. And that's like, why are the penises so small? And part of the reason why is because they don't want these figures to be sexual figures. So like in ancient Rome, like the ancient Romans, who we'll talk about later, they're really fond of having these sexual figures with like huge penises. So they make them smaller. That way you don't think of them as sexual figures. You think of them as representing other ideas. So for the first time, a contrast between the rigid and relaxed elements allow the viewer to feel the inner workings of the human body. So we don't just see the surface, we see what's underneath, and we see how that kind of mechanism underneath the flesh works. So the forms, moreover, have a new naturalism and harmonious proportion that together provide the basis for strong idealization characteristic of all subsequent Greek art. So when you see these figures, they look like they could be real, but no one's really this symmetrical or proportioned in this way in real life. Modern day bodybuilders try to reach this sort of symmetry and perfection and whatnot. But it's not, when they're looking at these figures, you're not necessarily seeing someone that's real. Like, athletes would obviously look really good and fit like this. But it's more important that they have this kind of mathematical perfection along with the other perfections that you see in the beauty of the figure. So this is Poseidon or Zeus. And you can kind of figure out for yourself why we don't know which it is, because whatever he was throwing was missing. And if it was Poseidon, it would have been a trident, which is basically looks like a fork. It's a spear. And then if it was Zeus, it would be a lightning bolt. So since that's missing, we're not sure which figure it's trying to represent. And you can see that this figure is 6'10". Sure, there's people that tall, like in the NBA and the NFL. But, they're obviously trying to make this figure kind of massive to represent that they're a god. So it's made of bronze using a lost wax process. And I'll get you a video in the description for this video so that you can see how this works. And this was first used for large-scale sculpture in the early classical period. And in the video, they might not mention this, but you have to do the sculptures in multiple pieces. You'll be able to see how that works when I show the video. So Greek artists studied athletes to create figures in action. So that goes on with their idea of showing the mechanism of the body. When you see these figures, they stand as an athlete would. And this is part of the reason why a lot of the figures we're going to look at here are made out of marble. But none of them were originally made that way, except for a couple of the ones that we've seen previously. During this time period, they thought bronze was the ideal material. The reason why is because you could make it look exactly like the human body. And if you wanted it to stand like this, you as an artist had to make it balanced in the same way that this athlete would have to be balanced to be able to throw a spear. When they talk about balance, sure, they're talking about visual balance, but they're also talking about a literal balance. And since bronze can stand on its own, it's lightweight. Once you get it balanced, it won't topple over. It's not just visually balanced, it's physically balanced. So what we'll see later on is you can't really do that with stone. You can't have arms sticking out this far. So a lot of the ones we're looking at that are in stone are copies of Greek originals. And this is one of them. This was originally made in bronze, but we don't have the original bronze. We just have copies that were made in ancient Rome a little bit later on. And this really shows the interest in athletics. Disglobos, it just means discus thrower. Myron, who was one of the famous artists of this time. And you can see how the athlete's body is tensing everywhere, exactly how you would expect them to do. And we're seeing a particular motion. Discus throwers, they spin around in a circle before they throw the discus. And it's a frozen moment in time, but it's not a random frozen moment in time. So when I was in high school, I took photography and I used to do sports photography. And what you get with sports photography is you take hundreds of pictures and then one might turn out right. And what you mean by right is it makes an interesting composition with the way that the body is positioned when you took the picture. And that's what the Greek artists were doing as well. There's a lot of motion that goes into throwing a discus, but this one makes interesting compositions. So you have a line that goes from the head all the way through the feet, and then you have another line that starts here and makes this nice arch going through his arms. So it has this balance. The original figure made out of bronze wouldn't have needed these pieces and would have stood on its own. So both a visual and a literal balance. So you don't just pick anything, you pick something that's balanced and interesting visually. So this one is getting towards what we would call the classical or high classical, but remember, that's 19th century art historians. They like this style the best. It doesn't necessarily mean it is the best. So this is a warrior from Riace. Riace is an Italian word, that's why it's pronounced that way. 6'6", so again, like a pretty large human if this person was there in real life. But the cool thing about this figure is it was actually found in a shipwreck. And one of the great things about bronze is if it gets in water, it develops a crust over it, and that crust protects the metal underneath. So even though this thing had been underwater for 2,450 years, when it was found in the shipwreck, it was pretty much in perfect shape. They just had to clean it off, and they found everything they needed. They even had the pieces that are missing from a lot of the bronzes that you see in museums today, some glass paste for the eyes, some bone for the teeth, copper inlay for the eyelashes and nipples. So just things to kind of like make it a little bit more realistic. The hair is still stylized. It's not what you would see in real life, but the proportions of the body, so we can see the body's a little broader, and the contrapposto is a little bit more obvious, like he's twisting more, and his leg is more bent, is more like what we would see in the classical period. So this is, I can just show one sculpture if I wanted to in this one. It's from Polykleitos, who's really well respected, and the kind of proportions that he came up with, people really like. So everyone pretty much said, this is how we should proportion our figures. This is the perfect masculine figure. So this is the spear bearer. Again, a copy made in marble by the Romans of a bronze original. So the bronze original would not have had this, would not have had this. Would have been able to stand on its own. And obviously the spear is missing. So sometimes it's called the high classical, but again, it doesn't mean it's better. It's just what 19th century art historians thought about it. So Polykleitos of Argos, it was thought at the time, people thought he was really great, the pinnacle of this particular style. So I used a canon, similar to what the ancient Egyptians had done, a set of ideal proportions. So the canon in this one is one head, and then we can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So a person is 7 heads tall. In later times, like in the Hellenistic period, you'll see smaller heads and taller bodies. In other words, they made people 8 heads tall. This doesn't necessarily represent real humans. Most humans would have like, a slightly smaller head than this dude, and will be, closer to 7.5 heads tall. But this was the proportions that at the time artists thought were particularly interesting. But the rest of the body is the same way. So the width of his chest related to the length of his arms, the length of his legs compared to the length of his arms, his hand compared to his forearm. All of these proportions are kind of set up. And the idea is that when you have these proportions that are considered to be ideal, it represents a kind of ideal person. So not only is this person like beautiful, like a fit athlete, and then proportion in this way that people found most pleasing, but that represents not just a visual goodness, but it represents a kind of like human perfection, not just visually, but also in other ways. So philosophically, spiritually. So the relationship between mathematics, proportions, geometry, and philosophy, and even what I think people would consider to be religion nowadays, is very important. They weren't separate like they are in modern times. So in contrast to the early classical, the hair is not stylized, so it's kind of similar hair to me. It looks more natural and kind of flows, and it's more three-dimensional. But what you see during this time period, again, they have idealized bodies. So there isn't necessarily a person running around ancient Greece that looks like this. The proportions of the face are also considered to be ideal. And I think, modern people would consider this person to be pretty handsome. But the facial expression was part of the ideal. So it's a pensive facial expression is how it's often described. Sometimes people see it as like kind of empty, perhaps, or focused but relaxed. So the idea is not to show too much emotion. And that was considered to be ideal at this time. And that's probably part of the reason why 19th century artists who thought that being emotionless for some reason in art in the late 19th century was an ideal. But, it's not what we're going to see always in art in this class. So classical figures are idealized forms of the human figure. The idea is if it's beautiful, both mathematically and just aesthetically, it equals goodness. So again, philosophy and math go together. When you look at the details, and this would have been obvious in the bronze original, you can see tendons on the foot. The foot is flattened just like it would if you were standing. You can see how the knee, when it bends, the flesh above the knee is displaced. You can kind of look at your own body and move around and see these types of things. So again, it shows more of the underlying structure of the body than the early classical. All of the structures are related together, making the figure seem even more alive. And these little connections and this weird thing growing out of his leg. Oh, by the way, these ancient Greek figures never skip leg day. So the lowers are always looking thick. But this stuff coming out of his leg and this one were not necessarily in the original bronze. The original bronze would have stood on its own. You just pop it down. It wouldn't need a stand or anything. That was part of the aesthetic. If you couldn't get your bronze to stand on its own, it wouldn't be a good work of art. It would literally not be balanced. So this last one shows you what you might think is in contradiction to what I said before. I said they don't show women nude. But what this particular nude figure represents is exactly what I was talking about and how women were considered versus men were considered. And this is a statue of a wounded Amazon. So the Amazon is one of those stories that really tells you about gender in ancient Greece. So the Amazonians were these women that were warriors that didn't need men. So in the ancient Greeks' minds, that means that they could fill the role of men, which would be to them rational, creative, all of these sorts of things. So when you look at this figure, even though it's a feminine figure, it wouldn't be a problem for the ancient Greeks to show her nude because to them, she's filling these masculine roles mythologically. But it shows you, you might see this like kind of showing up in modern patriarchal ideas. The idea that the only way that women could get equality is if they be like men, and that's part of the reason why a lot of men fear women being liberated, because they imagine women would dominate them as men dominate women, and they don't want that to happen. So in this one, we see also this classical period type of idealization overriding the narrative. We can't see it here because it's missing, but she would have had a spear that went into her heart. Obviously, if that happened to you in real life, it'd be extremely painful. But look at her face. Like nothing even happened. So the idealization of having this relaxed, pensive face overrides the narrative. The other thing you'll probably notice is that basically, and this goes along with the story and with their idea of what the Amazonians are, this is a male body. They used a male model to make this sculpture, and they just kind of slap breasts on it. So again, this isn't really breaking the taboo of showing women naked, because they're really looking at this figure as being masculine, despite the Amazonians being women.